Addressing Our Climate Future. It is what we know best. I gave this talk at the University of Michigan on April 13th, 2023. I came to Michigan in 2005. In my first couple of weeks here, I attended a conference on climate change sponsored by the Arbor Institute, which is a joint institute between the Ross Business School and what was then the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, now the School of Environment and Sustainability. I do not remember even saying a word at that conference, but three students, Michael Hesse, Nate Engel, and Doug Glancy, approached me after the conference and said the university urgently needed a science-based class that explored climate change and its relationship with the real world. The four of us sat down and drafted out a class and guest speakers. The climate science is the easy part. It is basic, simple physics in a complex system of fluids, chemistry, and biology. The relationship with the real world is hard. Over the years, as I have learned about the real world, I have had several important shifts in how I conduct the course. The first change came almost immediately. Students of climate science, who most had expected to have an almost intuitive understanding of the climate problem, were very focused on one detail or another and had not made connections to other parts of the Earth system. Nor were they well grounded in how climate science might be used in the real world. This led to a reframing of the class material, research with Maria Carmen Lemos on usability of knowledge, and the start of GLISA, the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Center. By 2008, I felt I could not maintain the mantra that we needed to avoid dangerous climate change and that a 2 degrees Celsius change in the global average temperature was the threshold of dangerous. It was obvious that we were already experiencing dangerous climate change and that it was far more likely we would see 4 degrees of warming than 2 degrees. I thought that focusing on 4 degrees might even be motivation to be serious about 2 degrees. I remember answering a request from Rosina Bierbaum at the beginning of the Obama administration. I wrote that I thought we had vastly underestimated the melting of ice, that the effects of a warming climate were emerging more rapidly than expected, and that there was no evidence to suggest that we would limit warming to 2 degrees. Around 2014, I was in the middle of another reframing. The message was starting to emerge that we needed to have an effective intervention to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 to avoid catastrophe. This was codified in Paris in 2015 with an ambitious target to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. By that time, a research paper had characterized 2 degrees of warming as dangerous. In the public, climate change was framed as the climate emergency, the climate crisis. I could not stand in front of a class and deliver these messages. I felt disingenuous, if not dishonest. Yes, 1.5 degrees was better than 2, but there was no real-world evidence that it could be achieved. The model storylines to achieve these goals were fantastic stories of miraculous possibility. Plus, I did not feel that the message of 10 years to catastrophe actually provided any skills or usable knowledge for the students. What was most important to me, however, as perceived in the public discourse, it framed climate change as an external problem that if we decided to fix it, we would fix it and have a stable climate and perhaps even return to some previous climate. This was simply an incorrect view of reality. People would talk about political will as if political will was something achieved at some moment when the collective mind would change, when all would become clear and climate would be a moral imperative. This conveyed to me a naivete on how the world worked and how problems were solved. The framing of climate change as an external problem takes us as individuals out of the problem and directs attention towards the failings of governments and corporations. It diminishes our power to affect the problem and absolves us of the responsibility to do so. We need to recognize that living and working in and with a changing climate is something that we must do under any conceivable reality. At this point in time, the climate is statistically different from one decade to the next, and we are not practically or behaviorally prepared to manage that. I want to take a diversion here. This picture is of my family's cabin on the coast of North Carolina. It is a place that is special to my family with many stories. My father, my older brother, and their friends built the cabin in the 1950s. I and my siblings spent much of the 1960s and 70s living there and working on it. My sister and her husband have it today. This picture was taken after Hurricane Florence and before Hurricane Dorian. It is intact, but the house is separated from its utilities. For more money than it is actually worth, it could be given another 30 tumultuous years, and then I expect it will be lost. It's a tough little house. My father wanted it to stand up to hurricanes. It was built out of timbers from an old train trestle and telephone poles. As I said, it is a tough little house. This is a picture of our next-door neighbor's cabin. The water is now more than 100 feet closer to the house than when it was built. There are 2 points from this story. The first is with climate change there will be loss, and we need to be prepared for that loss. Our lives have always been punctuated by loss, and how we manage loss in our lives is one of many challenges that determine how we will get along with life. The second point is that we've always been living, building, and coexisting with weather and climate. Most people do not live it as direct as this little house. They have been living with climate through zoning regulations, engineering standards, and building codes. Living with weather and climate is something we know how to do, and in fact do every day. That we know that the earth is warming and will continue to warm is one of the most certain things we know about the future. Some of the consequences of this warming, ice melting, sea level rise, extreme precipitation, extreme drought, and changing weather are occurring and will continue to occur. On one hand, this is scary, but we know why it is happening, which means we can do something about it. On the other hand, that we know what the future holds is one of the most powerful pieces of knowledge ever held by humans. In fact, it could be one of the least frightening aspects of our future. What I say I teach is climate change problem solving. I am aware that many do not know what I mean by that. Scientists talk about producing knowledge. They often justify their funding on the societal relevance of that knowledge. However, in order for science-based knowledge to be usable for a purpose, it has to be tailored to fit that purpose. It needs to be in context. It needs to be interpreted. From a classic paper on environmental behavior by Hines, Hungerford, and Tamaro, we need to correct the erroneous assumption that skills evolve naturally from knowledge. We need to be clear what to do with that knowledge, and we need to develop explicitly the skills of how to do it. But even that is not enough, because even with this, there is no guarantee that we will do it. In 2004, Pakula and Sokolow laid out an approach that with existing technology and efficiency, we could flatten the emissions curve to 2050. During that time, we could develop the technology that would be needed after 2050 to reduce carbon dioxide. We have known for decades that increased efficiency of fuel use not only was one of our biggest levers to address climate change, but one with fast payback. Some of us, some of our businesses use this knowledge, but as a society, we do not. we do not codify efficiency into policy. In fact, some try to codify that taking environmental and social costs into our economy should not be allowed. Broadly, the classes I have developed have an introduction to climate science that is rigorous in its exposure of and adherence to the scientific method. There is discussion of the interfaces of climate change to the real world. This discussion is not focused on, for example, that climate change will have impacts on public health or the economy, but that health emergencies and economic disruptions will slow, perhaps halt, our efforts to address climate change. Therefore, the challenge becomes, how do we keep attention on climate change during economic crises, pandemics, and wars? There is an introduction of techniques of problem solving. This is an evolving framework that I have developed over the last 17 years. What I teach is messy, but at some level that's the point, because the relationship of climate change with the real world is messy. Since 2016, a disproportionate amount of the class is focused on disinformation. So the challenge is, how do you manage disinformation and keep attention on climate change in disinformation campaigns? In the past few years, I have developed an overarching vision of what I try to teach. I want people to feel that they have not only some control, some purchase over climate change, but to feel that they have the skills, the authority, and the mandate to address climate change. I want them to have confidence that what they are doing will ultimately make a difference. How do we use knowledge to overcome the anxiety that leads to paralysis and inaction? Use knowledge to recognize and overcome barriers to applying climate knowledge. Identify and implement no regrets, easy win, substantive mitigation, and adaptation actions. Part of the skill set is to analyze problems of mitigation and adaptation in terms of time, near-term and long-term, in terms of spatial scale, local or global, and in terms of wealth. With regard to spatial scale, the most important point is that as we increase spatial scales, we introduce more people, more jurisdictions, more agencies, more power holders, and more stakeholders. The problem becomes more difficult. Intuitively, problems that are local and near term are easier to address than problems that are global and long term. Posing 2030 as a moment of catastrophe places us in a time pincer that is impossible. It takes the most difficult global long-term problem and turns it into a global short-term problem, a singularity, a catastrophe. The most difficult barriers we face are not technological, nor are they scientific. The problem is us. We are not very good at addressing hard problems that require cooperation and culture change. We are even less good at problem solving when we perceive the benefits as being realized decades from now. One reason that we are not very good at those problems is that they challenge our instinctual behavior. For some, guilt and shame move us to take action. For some, urgency moves us to take action. For others, urgency moves us to panic and despair. There is no single right approach, no single communication strategy that will magically align us to solve the climate change problem, to organize political will. One predictor does stand out as a likely measure of someone taking action. That predictor is self-efficacy, an individual's belief in their capacity to act in ways necessary to reach specific goals. There is another attribute that has high impact: education about which actions are likely to have outcomes with high benefits. That is, what actions have the most influence. I want all of the students in my classes to leave feeling that they have the capacity to act as individuals, influence their professions, change their institutions, and lead in their community. There is an urgency to reduce emissions. We must reduce, essentially eliminate emissions. We must figure out how to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and the ocean. We would be well served by avoiding geoengineering interventions such as reflecting sunlight. This is like putting the planet in the intensive care unit and relying on a utility to keep us going. Simultaneously, we are going to have to adapt. We are going to have to internalize a changing climate into our behavior and into our planning. We are going to have to live and work in a changing climate every day. We see this happening. It is maddeningly slow. But we see cases at scale of robust economies with reduced emissions. We see the evolution of bodies of law. After decades of inaction in the Semiconductor Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act, we see funds enacted in legislation and aligned with some meaningful climate goals. We even see in the war in Ukraine those actively working to reduce reliance on fossil fuels and de-weaponize energy supplies. The students who have taken my courses have found their ways into many professions. They are having influence. I hear from them occasionally that the courses focus on multidisciplinary, intersectional problem solving has served them well. That despite only being introduced to climate science, they are the climate expert in their organization. I maintain that there are many essential elements to solving climate change in all professions. I also maintain that knowledge is part of having capacity to act in ways necessary to reach specific goals. We need to work towards those goals over which we have direct influence. We need to advocate for those goals over which we do not have direct influence. We need to have the confidence to lead. We need to move on from the lamentations of loss due to climate change. Those who choose to use the knowledge of climate change will be better off and contribute to a better world. Thank you for listening.